Hi, my name is Elmira Louie. I am a senior in the Honors College, double majoring in comparative literature and English and minoring in Spanish. And my thesis is on methods and obstacles of feminist translation in Spanish, Persian, and Turkish poetry.
What inspired your thesis?
I was inspired to do this project because I knew from pretty early on that I want to do a multilingual thesis. So I started reading poetry in all these different languages. And eventually I stumbled upon this bilingual edition of Rosa de Castro, and this text was translated into English in 2014, and it's specifically a feminist translation. And I had never seen anything like that before. I didn't really know what that meant, so I started doing more research into what feminist translation is, and I realized that I really enjoyed the topic. And so I pulled together poems from poets from Farsi and also from Turkish, and to do this collective comparison into what it means to sort of apply feminist translation, both theory and practice, into these other languages that haven't been done before.
What is a feminist translation?
So a feminist translation is basically a type of translation that posits gender as the most crucial point of transfer. So all types of translations focus on something in particular that they find to be sort of the kernel of the text, the most important piece. So whether that's, the rhythm, the sound, the rhyme, the structure, the form. For feminist translation, that's gender and representations of gender. And to figure out how to portray that representation of gender that's in the source text into the new target text. And this is especially interesting when you consider sort of the history of gender and gender representation in literature. For example, when you're going, from French, there's a word for a female author. But in English, it's just one word, and it's author. So how do you make that female presence visible in the text that has been sort of historically excluded? And so that's sort of what feminist translation grapples with, and to coming up with methods to do so.
Do you speak all of the languages you're researching?
Yes, so Farsi is my first language, and then English my second. And then I picked up Spanish in high school and just sort of continued throughout. And I also started studying Turkish at UW for the past 4 years. So.
What has been your favorite poem to read and translate?
It's a very hard question. So my thesis is split into 3 chapters, and each focuses on one specific female poet in each of these languages. But I think the one that I keep coming back to a lot is in the Turkish chapter. So the poet is Gülten Akın, and she was writing in sort of 20th century Turkey. And the poem, it's a very short poem, and it's called Kum, which means sand. And the reason why I really like this is because Akın in general, her style is she's very focused on sort of playing with imagery and symbols and sort of representation.
What surprised you the most while you were translating the text?
Yeah, so the most surprising thing for me is that it was much easier to translate between Persian into English or Turkish into English than Spanish into English. So starting off, I had assumed Spanish would be the easiest because Spanish and English are so close to each other. There's a lot of words that sound the same, that mean the same thing. But what ended up happening is that because they're so close, it makes it harder to create a poetic translation. It's much easier to just transfer the words from each, and you're like, yeah, that's the words, that's what it means, there we go. But that literal translation makes it more difficult to move past it and to create something that flows in the English, that sounds as smooth as the Spanish poem does. Whereas when you're going from Persian and Turkish into English, because those 2 languages are so different from English, a literal translation is just most of the time pure nonsense. So you have to sort of understand the gist and the meaning of the text in order to translate it into English. So basically right off the bat, what you get is a much more poetic translation from the first draft into the English. Then that's probably the equivalent of the 3rd or 4th draft of the Spanish into English, because for those ones you have to think sort of more creatively in terms of getting the meaning across, right? Because if you just get the actual words, it's not gonna make sense. So that was definitely the most surprising thing, is that it's much easier to go from 2 languages that are completely different than to go from ones that are very similar.
Why did you choose these 3 languages?
Yeah, so I've gotten this question a lot, and it's totally valid because oftentimes, when we think of languages and literatures and comparing them, we often think of sort of Middle Eastern studies, which is like, Farsi and Turkish and Arabic, or Romance languages, which is like Spanish, Italian, French. But never do we really see them sort of overlap and intersect. And so one of the reasons, mainly I chose these three languages because they're the ones that I know besides English. But beyond that, I think it's very important to sort of go beyond this sort of confinement that traditional area studies has placed in academia. And we can also see there's a lot of points of contact between these three languages. When you look at sort of like the Mediterranean with Islamic Spain and the Persian Ottoman empires, there was a lot of connection and overlap between these languages historically. And we see that even to this day in the lexicon of the languages. There's a lot of vocab that appears in these languages that is quite similar. And it's because of these points of contact. So from that, I think it's very important to consider going beyond sort of the structure that is set with area studies, especially when you're considering doing sort of a transnational analysis, which is what my project aims to do. And in order to sort of highlight the differences in these languages, but also find the commonality.
Thanks so much for meeting with us today.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.